The public image of Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively is usually built around humor, business success, and a carefully managed celebrity brand. But behind the scenes, a legal dispute tied to a traffic accident in New York has quietly unfolded, and it's now drawing attention because of the amount of money involved and the unusual circumstances surrounding it. At the center of the situation is a lawsuit seeking up to $5 million in damages, and although Reynolds himself wasn't driving, the vehicle involved in the incident was connected to him through a company that owns the car. The case traces back to the morning of March 2024, when a collision occurred in Manhattan near the Tribeca area, not far from where Reynolds owns property. According to the complaint, a Tesla registered to a company associated with Reynolds was being driven by an employee named Olivia Philippe. At the same time, another vehicle was traveling in the same direction on West Street. That vehicle was part of the city's Access a Ride program, a transportation service designed to assist individuals who cannot use regular public transit due to physical, cognitive, or other disabilities. The Access a Ride car had a driver and 2 passengers on board when the crash occurred. The lawsuit was filed by one of those passengers, Taji Toki Kelly, who claims to have been injured during the collision. The complaint describes how the Access a Ride vehicle was traveling southbound in the left lane when the Tesla moved in front of it from the middle lane. According to the allegation, the Tesla then stopped abruptly at a traffic light. Because the roads were wet, the Access a Ride driver was unable to stop in time, and the vehicle struck the Tesla from behind. Damage reports from the scene suggest that the Tesla sustained bumper damage, while the Access a Ride vehicle suffered heavier impact to the front bumper and hood. At the time of the accident, the driver of the Tesla reportedly did not provide personal identification or driver's license at the scene, instead presenting documentation connected to the vehicle's registration and insurance, which were linked to Ryan Reynolds. This detail later became important when attorneys attempted to determine who was responsible and which company or individuals should be named in the lawsuit. Because the Tesla was owned through a holding company associated with Reynolds, identified in filings as Walker Holdings LLC, the legal responsibility potentially extends beyond the driver alone. Under typical liability rules, the owner of a vehicle can be financially responsible for accidents caused by someone operating that vehicle with permission, especially if the driver is an employee. As a result, the lawsuit names both the driver and the company connected to Reynolds as defendants in the case. Initially, the accident report itself did not document confirmed injuries or trigger a major police investigation. However, the legal complaint filed months later tells a different story. The plaintiff claims the crash caused severe and permanent personal injuries, along with economic losses beyond what standard insurance policies cover. These allegations form the basis for the demand of up to $5 million in damages, which includes compensation for injuries that the plaintiff argues are lasting and life-altering. The timeline of the lawsuit also raises interesting questions about how the case developed. After the crash in early March 2024, it took months for attorneys to identify the full chain of ownership behind the Tesla. The complaint had to be amended twice before Reynolds' company was formally added as a defendant. By the time the lawsuit was officially filed in October 2024, the claim already included the same $5 million demand for damages, even before the vehicle was publicly linked to Reynolds. That detail has become significant because it suggests the lawsuit may not simply be targeting a celebrity for a large payout. According to the complaint, the damage estimate and legal claims were already in place before Reynolds' name entered the case, meaning the legal strategy appears to be based primarily on the injuries and liability rather than the celebrity status of the vehicle's owner. As the legal process continues, the case now involves multiple parties, including the owner of the Access a Ride vehicle, the driver operating it, the company linked to Reynolds, and the employee who was behind the wheel of the Tesla. Each of them may ultimately argue who bears responsibility for the accident and how any damages should be divided.
As the lawsuit moved forward, the legal battle quickly became more complex than a standard car accident claim. Multiple defendants entered the case, and each of them began presenting arguments about who should ultimately be held responsible. On one side is the passenger who filed the lawsuit, Taji Toki Kelly, who maintains that the crash and the resulting injuries were caused entirely by the negligence of the drivers involved. On the other side are several parties attempting to limit their liability, including the driver of the Tesla, the companies tied to the vehicles, and organizations connected to the transportation program. The central claim from the plaintiff is that the accident resulted from careless and reckless driving. According to the complaint, the defendants failed in their duty to properly operate and manage the vehicle, leading to the collision that allegedly caused serious injuries. The legal filing uses language common in personal injury lawsuits, accusing the defendants of negligence in the ownership, operation, supervision, maintenance, and control of the vehicle involved in the crash. The plaintiff further claims that the injuries sustained were not minor. The lawsuit alleges severe and permanent personal injuries that have caused lasting physical and economic consequences. In New York, lawsuits seeking damages of several $1 million typically involve claims of long-term or permanent harm, such as major physical injuries, lasting disability, or conditions that significantly affect a person's ability to work and live normally. Because of this, the plaintiff must eventually present medical documentation and evidence showing exactly what injuries occurred and why they are considered permanent. Insurance law in New York also plays a key role in how this case is structured. The state uses what is known as a no-fault insurance system, which means that medical expenses and some economic losses are initially covered by insurance regardless of who caused the accident. According to the complaint, some of those costs have already been reimbursed through insurance coverage. The lawsuit therefore focuses only on damages that go beyond what no-fault insurance would normally pay, including long-term medical consequences or major financial losses. Another layer of complexity involves the organizations connected to the Access a Ride transportation program. That service operates under the umbrella of New York's public transit system, managed by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. However, many of the vehicles used in the program are actually run by independent contractors. Because of that structure, the Transit Authority has argued in court filings that it should not be directly responsible for the accident, stating that it only oversees the program while outside companies handle the day-to-day operations. Meanwhile, the companies connected to the vehicles involved in the crash have also presented their own defenses. Rather than asking the court to dismiss the case outright, the defendants have submitted formal responses denying liability and raising what are known as affirmative defenses. These are legal arguments that attempt to reduce or shift responsibility for the accident. For example, one possible defense is that the injuries may have been worsened by other factors, such as whether the passenger was properly restrained by a seatbelt. Another major issue in the case is how responsibility might be divided if the case eventually goes to trial. In many traffic accident lawsuits, fault can be split among multiple parties, depending on how the jury interprets the events. If a jury determines that several drivers contributed to the crash, each party could be assigned a percentage of responsibility. That means financial damages would be distributed proportionally, rather than being paid entirely by one defendant. In this situation, the defense teams appear to be preparing for exactly that kind of scenario. The companies involved have argued that if liability is ultimately proven, responsibility should be divided among all parties connected to the incident. This includes the drivers of both vehicles, as well as any companies that owned or operated them. In other words, the legal strategy may focus less on denying that the accident happened and more on disputing how much each party should pay if damages are awarded. At the same time, the Transit Authority has attempted to distance itself from the dispute entirely. Lawyers for the organization have asked the court for summary judgment, a legal ruling that would remove them from the case before it reaches trial. Their argument is that since the vehicles in the Access a Ride program are run by contractors, the authority itself should not be held liable for the actions of the driver involved. With several defendants pointing responsibility at each other and the plaintiff claiming serious permanent injuries, the lawsuit has evolved into a complicated legal dispute involving insurance law, liability rules, and corporate ownership structures. And as the case has unfolded, another factor has drawn attention: the timing of the lawsuit and the broader circumstances surrounding Ryan Reynolds and his business ventures during the same period.
As the case continued moving through the legal system, the timeline surrounding the lawsuit began to attract additional attention. The crash itself happened in March 2024, but the formal complaint that added the company connected to Ryan Reynolds was not filed until October of that year. That gap of several months is not unusual in personal injury cases, since victims often wait until medical treatment progresses before deciding whether to pursue additional legal action. However, in this situation, the timing coincided with several other developments involving Reynolds and Blake Lively, which has led some observers to speculate about the broader context surrounding the dispute. According to the details described in the lawsuit, the plaintiff likely first received compensation through New York's no-fault insurance system. That coverage typically handles immediate medical bills and certain lost wages after an accident. Only after those initial payments are processed do plaintiffs often pursue further legal claims for long-term damage, especially if injuries are believed to be permanent or significantly life-altering. By the time the October filing occurred, the plaintiff had already alleged that the injuries were severe and permanent, which explains the request for damages reaching as high as $5 million. From the legal filings that followed, it appears none of the major defendants attempted to immediately dismiss the case. Instead, they filed responses contesting responsibility and raising a variety of legal defenses. This approach typically indicates that the parties expect the case to proceed through discovery, the phase where attorneys exchange evidence, medical records, and witness testimony to determine exactly what happened and how serious the injuries are. Another point that has drawn attention is that the accident itself is not heavily disputed. The collision appears to be acknowledged by the parties involved, and the legal battle is focused more on the degree of fault and the severity of the injuries. In cases like this, a significant part of the courtroom argument often centers on medical evidence. The plaintiff must demonstrate that the injuries meet the legal definition of serious injury under New York law, which can include permanent disfigurement, major impairment of bodily functions, or injuries that significantly limit normal daily activities. If those standards are proven, the financial stakes of the lawsuit become much larger. A jury would then be asked not only to determine who caused the accident, but also how the resulting damages should be calculated. That calculation can include medical costs, lost income, long-term treatment, and compensation for pain and suffering. Because multiple defendants are involved, the final outcome could also depend on how fault is divided between the drivers and the companies connected to the vehicles. Meanwhile, the presence of several corporate entities in the case adds another layer to the legal strategy. The Tesla involved in the accident was connected to a company associated with Reynolds, meaning that any liability could potentially extend to that business structure rather than to the actor personally. Ownership arrangements like this are common among high-profile individuals, especially when vehicles or properties are tied to corporate holdings rather than personal names. As the lawsuit continues, the next phases will likely involve depositions, expert testimony, and further motions from both sides. Courts will review medical documentation, accident reports, and witness statements to determine whether the claims of permanent injury hold up under scrutiny. At the same time, defense attorneys will attempt to challenge the extent of those injuries or argue that responsibility should be shared among multiple parties involved in the crash. For now, the case remains unresolved, and like many complex civil lawsuits, it may take considerable time before a final outcome is reached. Whether the dispute ends in a settlement or proceeds to trial will depend on what evidence emerges during the discovery process and how strongly each side believes its case can be proven in court. What began as a relatively ordinary traffic accident has gradually evolved into a multi-party legal battle involving corporate ownership, insurance law, and serious injury claims, one that continues to develop behind the scenes.